My mic on? Hello, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I hope you're all fair and energized. So, let's dive right back in and start off with another significant panel discussion on the topic solving Silicon Valley's diversity problem. To give us a detailed overview on the topic and share useful insights, we have Kelly Karnes, President and CEO of Tech Vision 21. Annie Holmes, co-founder at Elevated Levels, Vincent W. Allen, managing director at VAAV Industries, and Ashley Noel Sharp, executive director at Dwell with Dignity. Can we have a round of applause for them, please? Take the stage.
Hello. I know there's like 10 people in here, but it's going to feel like 10,000, so it's going to be awesome. Thank you guys for being here with us today. My name is Ashley Sharp, and I will be moderating this incredible panel. So thank you. I know that we're in the lunch coma stage. Enjoy taking the conversation. I'm just going to ask each of my panelists to introduce yourselves, and for a little icebreaker first. Okay, Kelly, kick us off.
Kelly Carnes. I'm president and CEO of Tech Vision 21. We're an innovation policy consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. We help companies and governments and universities work with the federal government in various ways, including on R&D projects, competing for grants, working on STEM projects. We've done a lot of government-related STEM work.
First concert?
The Beach Boys.
Okay,
That sounds
that's a really good one.
The first concert.
Hi, my name is Annie Holmes. I'm founder of Elevated Levels Foundation for Green. We are a family nonprofit. Our focus is on addressing social health for Black and brown communities, and we are doing that and accomplishing that in arts and learning and economic development. Our efforts, and I'm going to be honest with the diversity session, and my here is probably going to be only those with the group that I saw at my first concert, and they were a gospel group called the Winans.
Very cool.
Anybody know? Anybody? Anyone? No? Not a little bit of a hand?
We got one.
Okay.
BB or CC? I only got one question. Was it BB or was it CC?
Oh no, see, old school. It was the four brothers.
Oh, okay now.
Yes.
Love it. Vincent.
On that note, my name's Vincent Allen. My company is VAAV Industries. We're a production company. We do production design and engineering, so designing all the back-end systems that allow your TVs and your live streams to function, but also doing the camera and basically everything you see the guys doing in the back of the room. And the reason I actually started the company is she's sitting here in the back of the room right now. My little girl Naomi is sitting here watching. And the goal was just to try to solve some of the diversity issues in the technology space, in the production space, where you have amazing women doing amazing things, but have to work 3 times as hard to get a third of credit. And so that's the goal of the company, is to try to solve that and to tell those stories in a way that's skillful, robust, and meaningful.
First concert.
First concert. I don't know if anyone in this room is going to remember that, but the benefit when Premier Gorbachev came to the United States in '88.
Oh,
That was my first concert.
wow.
Jerry Seinfeld did a set. A significant amount of musicians were there. That would be my first. Yeah.
Very cool.
He did not. He did not. Unfortunately.
He came in for
I mean, no, he did.
Okay, so I was in a meeting the other day, and we were talking about DE&I, and very bravely, I think, someone stopped the meeting and said, "Could you please tell me what DE&I is?" And I was kind of horrified, but then I realized that just because we talk about it all day doesn't mean that everyone else talks about it all day. So could each of you tell me what you believe DE&I is and why it's important? Yeah, we'll walk it down.
Okay. I think that diversity has many elements. It includes the obvious age, gender, ethnicity, um, but I would go well beyond that to diversity of opinions, ideas, um, political parties, and political views. One of my closest coworkers and I adamantly are in different political camps, but yet we work together extremely successfully and produce really great work as a result of it.
There we go.
So before I started Elevated Levels, I was a three-time first time chief diversity officer for three different organizations.
Wow.
So this here question is right up my
I'm glad.
alley. So I I have literally had to define and redefine throughout my 20 plus career being a Jedi. I get to call myself that because I was actually awarded a Jedi award. So as a Jedi, really including justice in there, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
So when you're talking about diversity, that's representation. That's what you hear people talking about representation. Do you see difference? Is difference represented? And then when you start to talk about inclusion, are their voices represented? Are their perspectives represented? Then once their voices are shared, that then changes the outcome for everyone at the table because then now we have equity. And once we accomplish equity, we get to spaces where policies are changed to um, better humanity versus policies being for compliance, right? And so, how do we put the people in front of it so that we actually achieve justice? And so, from my perspective, DEI really is about understanding not just representation is needed, but you got to have representation. You have to allow people their authentic voice and to speak to that, and then not take that away, but ensure that they continue to be a part of the story that needs to be told.
I think for me, I mean, we heard earlier in a panel earlier talking about how to change the culture in our working places and things like that. And unfortunately, for better or for worse, it's that's usually lip service. It's a placebo, it's a sugar pill to hire someone who fits a specific criteria, a person of color, a woman, someone who's disabled in some meaningful way, to be the public face of, look, we're not racist, look, we're not sexist, look, our company isn't bigoted, don't dig too much into what we were doing during World War II or before the 1900s or whatever. So usually, unfortunately, usually it's it's a token to say, don't sue us, right? But I think what's important about it and what it means to me is providing those voices for people to say what needs to be said in a place that's safe, right? Um, but giving them the equity that you spoke about, which is not the same as equality. And it's not saying, hey, this is a meritocracy. We don't see this difference or that difference or that difference, because what you're really doing is saying you don't see them at all.
Well, and I know that this panel specifically is titled to address Silicon Valley, but this is an issue that we see everywhere. But why do you think a lot of this did start in Silicon Valley, and how have we seen that play out?
Well, I can speak to that. So 20 plus years ago, I was working on becoming a network engineer. Right, I was doing all the Cisco Network Academy stuff. The only person that wasn't a male in the room was the instructor. Bunch of guys. I don't have to tell you what that room smelled like. It was a bunch of 16 to 17-year-old boys. But that being said, there were no women in the room. And every program I did after that, you might have one woman, you might have two, maybe three, from a very specific background ethnically, right? And so unfortunately now we're living in a world where we're reaping the fruit of that, where all of the people that are in these decision-making positions, where all of the people that were in university 20 years ago, 25 years ago, came up through the ranks where this is the way it looks. These are the people who are doing the work, and these are the people who get to be in decision-making positions. And for better or for worse, they all look like me. It's just the way, and unfortunately, it's the way it is right now. And we haven't significantly invested in programs where we're trying to recruit people who have different opinions, who look different, who come from a different background, or maybe come from a different country or whatever, right? And that's why we have that problem in technology right now, is because we didn't address it 10, 15, 20, 25 years ago. And so if we want to solve it, we got to address it now for when all of our kids are coming out of university.
Well, oh, Annie.
I actually worked at a university as a chief diversity officer. At Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo, California, I was the first chief diversity officer there, and I established the office. I established all of the programs, conducted the culture survey so that we could understand what the issues were, and then be able to communicate back out to all of our stakeholders, students, alum, anyone who was interested, town and gown, right? Anyone who participated in some way with the organization, we wanted to make sure that they had a positive experience. And we did it through a DEI lens. We were very open and honest about the fact that we were on a campus with 20,000 students and there were 0.7% Black students on that campus in the state of California. That is problematic. So then you take the lower numbers. I think when I first started, we had 9% Latinx, and that's problematic in the state of California. By the time we left, we did increase our Latinx numbers, thankfully, to 13%, and we had gotten the African American numbers up to 1%. But what was interesting was I was able to be pulled into a lot of the conversations in recruiting and with some of the boards, so Boeing, your Apples, your like all of those big tech Silicon Valley companies were recruiting very heavily from Cal Poly. It's an engineering school, architecture school. Folks, prime pick from Cal Poly, and because there was no strong population of students who were effectively, let's say, tracked from a K 12 education system into engineering fields to know that that was an option for them. Now you don't have anyone to pick from. You don't have anyone to provide that access for. So one of the things that I did while I was there was found out one of the Cal State Board of Directors had a charter school system. She had just started it out and she was expanding it into her middle school. I worked out a partnership with her and her schools to bring her middle school students to the campus. When she was ready to start her high school, Cal Poly, their slogan is learn by doing. She created a learn by doing high school in Sacramento. And so then what she did was she created a critical mass of students who were qualified for that institution. However, then what we also don't talk about is it's not always the recruitment, it's also the retention. And so when we don't do anything to address, again, policies, culture, all of those things within the organization, then we lose and people as well. And so then our numbers really don't look like we're moving because you've got a door and folks are coming in and out of your organization. And so you can usually you can look at it at some of the websites. I won't name any of them, but some of the job search websites, and you will see certain jobs come up all the time. Why? What's going on there? We should start asking questions.
Yes.
And folks like me who have had jobs where I have had to ask the difficult questions. I'm the friend that tells you what you don't want to hear, and I'll do it with a smile because it's going to be better for all of us in the end.
Someone has
get
to.
out of our own head.
Before we move on, I want to ask you a follow-up, Annie. So you were working with the university, and they had a 0.7% student population that was Latinx in a place that's historically Mexico.
It was 9%. It was 9% in a place that was historically Mexico. Correct.
So what were they doing?
The
Or not?
Chumash Indian reservation as well. Yes.
Yes. So what were they doing, or maybe the better question is not doing, to get to that place where their matriculation rate and then the retention rate of people who of a group of people who is one of the largest population groups in that locality? What were they doing to not bring it in?
Great question. They had a higher population of Black and Latinx students in the 70s than they did in 2013 when I landed on that campus. When I started to talk to the alumni and brought them back in, they said there was more community on campus. When I walked onto that campus, You could pretty much go onto any college campus and find like groups of students, typically by ethnicity, by
Mhm.
gender, by interest, hanging out somewhere. I could not find students of color hanging out anywhere. And
Because
when
there
I
weren't any.
asked why, they said it's because they did not feel safe being seen as more in as a group. Because someone, a white person, a white student would pass by and say, "What are you guys up to?" So I don't feel at home. I go back home and tell everybody, "You're not going to feel at home." So then what I found out was happening was the high school guidance counselors were gatekeeping. They had kids that would thrive academically on the campus, but because of the stories others were coming back to tell when they went home to community, we couldn't get those students back.
Well, and I would love to ask you, I mean, as a female founder and a CEO and someone who's actually worked on workforce development, how do you see that play out and how can you encourage other voices to actually be in these rooms?
Well, let me take a step back. I think we have, it's not just a Silicon Valley problem, as you guys have said, it is a nationwide problem. And it's not a problem from the past, it's a problem that's going to get even worse as we go into the future. I mean, if you look at the changes in the American population that are expected, 20 years from now, we're going to be a minority majority country. So we need to be including persons from all backgrounds and more minority students and more women, and we're losing so many in high school for the reasons that you guys have been talking about, that guidance counselors are not encouraging them, but they're also not being trained in the foundational skills that are necessary to pursue a STEM degree in some cases.
But do you think that that's a high school issue or that's starting early on in their
It's
scholastic
starting
endeavors?
early on. I mean, it's going through the entire K through 12 system. You have to give kids the opportunity to be excited about science and math and to want to pursue a tech career. And then you have to give them the foundational knowledge and skills and the background courses in STEM that allow them to pursue STEM in college. And the numbers are really stark. I mean, that there's, I think it's only 20 something percent of computer science degrees go to women,
Right.
and only about 10% go to minority students. And we can't build the economy for the future on that foundation. I mean, what has given us our success for over 200 years is our culture of innovation. I mean, we have innovation written into the Constitution. It's always been the way America has succeeded through war, through growth periods, through different industry sectors. And we really have to be focused on growing the economy and national security for the future. Let me just throw in here one
Yeah.
thing. I've done a lot of work with the defense and industrial base companies, and they're really suffering because, in addition, they have the same needs, same tech needs as the private sector companies, but they're less attractive places to work because people perceive that they're making weapons rather than working in an R&D lab or doing something that's
Sure.
tech-based. And it is very, very challenging. They've got severe shortages on the horizon for computer scientists, engineers, and microelectronics people. It's severe issues with microelectronics.
And do
And
you?
so I've had a lot of, I know I look like I'm 27, but I've had a lot of jobs. So the last job I had before stepping into my entrepreneurial role, I actually worked for a national organization that worked at the with all of the states in the U.S. Department of Education as well as the U.S. territories. Um, when COVID happened, I we all got on Zoom and I got on with all of those state leaders and I said, if you are not committed to innovating right now, the K-12 education system is going to fall apart. It's not going to survive COVID. We did not innovate. It is not surviving COVID. And to be honest, I know we haven't gotten to the answer, but I think the answer not just for Silicon Valley, but for everyone is we ha- we have to either strategize on, are we going to dismantle systems and rebuild them, or are we going to allow for other systems to grow authentically based out of the community members who are building them? And if you want to learn more about that, read up on Paulo Freire.
Well, one of the things that makes me think about is we talk about the pandemic and everything that did and didn't happen, and there's a lot to discuss, right? But there are two things that I want to just bring to the forefront. One, every number that you could look at suggests that every human on Earth who was of working age was 200% more effective during COVID than they had been in the 10 years prior. Now, on the coattails of that is that you have a significant amount of large companies that leverage that and used the work from home capability during the pandemic to force women out of the workforce in numbers we haven't seen since the 60s and 70s, where you have, I mean, we're all adults here for the most part. You know what happens when you take adults, lock them in their house for 2 years and say you can't leave? You're gonna have a baby boom. That's what's gonna happen, right? And so historically, the cultural expectations, at least in this country, are that that's a woman's job. That's not true. Like, I'm a single father. Like, there are plenty of men out there who can do the job and do the job. But from a professional standpoint, he, these companies, they used it as leverage to say, excuse me, ma'am, yes, you can work from home if you'd like to, but you're going to take 70 cents on the dollar. And because their partner could, because of wage gap conversations, could make more money, a lot of these women took those opportunities to be at home because in a major city, childcare is basically a full salary. And and so there, I think we need to, if we're going to solve this in our lifetimes, we need to start having conversations not about the technology or who's doing what, but the cultural dynamics at play that say you get to do this and you get to do that. And I think we were talking about where it starts. Well, I got to tell you, as a girl dad, I get very frustrated around her birthday and around Christmas time when she wants something that is traditionally a toy that's meant for a boy. And it's, we don't, you don't, you can't go on to any website where you could buy a toy and see a toy kitchen set in a traditional boy color. They don't make them. And you don't see toy drill presses or any of this other kind of stuff in colors we traditionally associate with young girls. And I think that's where the problem starts, because every one of us in this room who works in technology didn't just discover it in undergrad, right? We all started by liking things that were traditionally considered nerdy or whatever. Absolutely. And just running with the damn thing, right? And figuring stuff out, tinkering with stuff, and just playing around until we figured out who we were and what we wanted to do. And if we're not marketing those kinds of things in a gender neutral sort of way, then we're going to have this problem when my 8-year-old has grandkids. I mean, that's the reality.
Yes. I'm currently expecting, and my stepdaughter asked me very cutely, "Oh my gosh, you still have to work when you're pregnant?" Yes, I do. I will work until the moment I'm in labor. Thank you so much. But that is the ideology.
Work harder.
I have to work I have to work hard as a working mother. I have to work harder than anyone else because I have to prove that the baby isn't slowing me down. But how do we stop these ideologies? I think that's so difficult. This is something that's obviously ingrained in them since birth, but how do we change the conversation, like you were saying, the marketing, how we represent these opportunities? And I'm going to go ahead and throw in some extra stress here. Obviously, we've all heard about SCOTUS and affirmative. So these numbers are already so low for women, especially in these spaces, and minorities. And now what's going to happen? I mean, I can't even imagine how much lower these numbers are going to look.
You've raised a big issue. Most of the experts, at least that I've been reading recently, seem to think there's going to be a dramatic drop off, and there doesn't seem to be any response yet. Of course, it's early.
It's very early.
Um, so when I worked at Cal Poly, in the state of California, if you are a public institution, you could not use state funding toward diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this did not just start, people. Like,
Yeah.
this has been in existence for quite some time. The US of A has been moving in this direction. Um, it's a chicken and egg situation because having gone into these organizations and having done the work, honestly, it's around organizational health because when one of my first jobs was as a coordinator of diversity education for Penn State University. So I used to travel to all 23 campuses and locations and do diversity training. So black woman, natural hair, walks into Central Pennsylvania campus. Didn't feel safe, but that's okay. I'm still here. But I would do diversity trainings in those communities, and I had to recognize, how do I tell the story so that you understand my context? Because you'll never understand. I can hand you these kicks, you'll never understand. And so I think from a systemic perspective, or from a systems perspective, when we're looking at a DEI issue to address systems and the impact that it's going to have on systems, we've definitely got to pay more attention to what those systems have put into place to further oppress. So that leads me into the affirmative action um, um, decision, because the way now to access higher education, as Black women have thrived and become one of the most highly educated groups in the US, now we're seeing a shift where it's saying, well, if you don't have the money, if you go through the services, and then we'll allow you an education through your GI Bill, which we already have a GI Bill. So I'm not really sure why we needed this in the affirmative action clause. So what we're finding is, instead of bridges being built, gaps are being dug. And we have to create other pathways for children, young folk to even know the possibilities. So when you started to talk about like the different areas of engineering that you're seeing a need for in the future, I'm thinking, how do I then go back to my community and tell my superintendent, not just we need a STEM program, but here are the jobs, and here I learned about ethical hacking from my 9 year old. I did. I heard about it, and I went to him. I said, I heard about ethical hacking, mommy. He starts telling me about it. These babies are ready. And my husband and I made the decision to pull them out of the educational system to focus on learning so that they could thrive. And if we're not focusing on whether an organization is healthy enough so that the staff can thrive, if we're not focusing on a hospital to make sure that the providers are educated enough to understand how to handle patients, and that self advocacy and patient advocacy should be applauded in ERs and not shunned in ERs, there's a this is systemic through all of the systems. And the last thing I'll say about it is that's because the systems were built for certain people to thrive. And those of us who are in this room, many of us who are in this room, were not included in that group, that the education system, that the industrialization, all of the systems were created for. We were not a part of that. So we've got some choices to make. And I've got some Gen Zers at home that are just like, just burn it all down, Mom. Just burn it all down.
Woo! Yeah, well, I will add these are not complete solutions, but there are a good number of outstanding programs that are growing up in the K through 12 arena that are having success. One of them is FIRST, for inspiration of science and recognition of science and technology, run by a gentleman named Dean Kamen, who was an inventor. He developed the insulin pump and a stair climbing wheelchair, a real entrepreneur and innovator. And he had the idea of kids love sports. let's make a game out of this. So he created a program where the kids build robots, and then the robots compete against each other in a different game. They throw rings or they shoot basketballs or whatever. And that program started out with 5 or 6 schools, and it's now several hundred. Still not big enough. And it does attract a really great community of kids. They have all girls teams, they have blended teams, they have small teams. Some schools are small and they can only get 5 or 6 people together, and then some have 50. And the great thing about the program is that companies have started to recognize it. And almost every single kid that comes out of that program gets a scholarship somewhere. So it's great.
That's
So
amazing.
as a follow-up to that, that's great. I mean, that's a great
Put your girls first.
initial step, right?
Amen.
But how do we then take a program like that? I mean, listen, to run a robotics program requires so much capital, right? It's an expensive program to run, and I think we all know, like communities all over this country, we know the communities that are going to be able to afford to have those programs and to bring people in from the community that have an expertise in coding or the mechanical engineering, the robotics or whatever. And we all know the places that will not be able to afford to. Like where I'm from in New York City, South Bronx is one of the poorest congressional districts in the country. But if you go, the entire island of Manhattan is 8 miles long. South Bronx is right across the water from that. If you go down to Battery Park City, the public schools have marble on the floor. So how do we then take that and marry that to what we're all talking about today and be able to build these programs that are sustainable at scale for everybody? Because that's the core of the issue, in my opinion.
Well, and I would love to talk about socioeconomic issues, especially people who work in tech companies who are not in tech positions. Just because you work for Apple does not mean you are an engineer. And so I think that there's a huge divide in people who are not even able to live in the area where they work because they're being pushed out. And how do we deal with that disparity for people who work for these companies? But every organization needs janitorial, they need marketing, they need HR, and those opportunities and that pay, quite frankly, is not equal.
Not in the slightest. And I think what you're really talking about, if we're going to talk open the socioeconomic can of worms, what we're really talking about is gentrification. And what we're really talking about is communities, mostly communities of color, that have lived in a specific locality for generations. And in some places, like on the East Coast, there's rent control laws. Other places, things work differently. But they've been there for a very long time, and then they get pushed out by a large developer who then takes a building and knocks it down or guts it, turns around and resells those apartments for quadruple what they were going for, and then appropriates the culture of that community. There is a place, again, in the Bronx in New York, where they did this a few years ago, and they tried. At first, they tried to call the South Bronx Sobro, and you would know because you're from Newark, how that went over in the South Bronx. People were ready to fight, and then they did it again, and they tried to call it the Piano District, and people were again ready to fight because what they had done was they had taken a series of old tenement buildings, gutted them, taken a 10 or 12 unit building, made it a 6-unit building, and made them into these luxury lofts, and then cleaned up, took away all of the graffiti, which is cultural in that part of the world, and then put a wrought iron sculpture of graffiti out front, and then charged 5 to 8 times what people were paying in that neighborhood. And I heard the snickering because it is ridiculous. And that's not just happening where I'm from in New York City. It's happening in every major city in this country. And until we can address that, that's going to have to be legislated because we live in a capitalistic society and large hedge funds and whatever are not going to stop doing it. Right?
That's so performative.
It really, really is.
Oh my God.
It's sick. But the question is then how do you solve that, right? How do you solve that? When can we legislate something nationally and then it becomes a states' rights issue and then SCOTUS gets involved? Or does it have to be a state by state or community by community basis? Because if we go state by state, we all know what's going to happen. It's going to look very much like education and reproductive rights and every other hot button issue we could talk about, where there are going to be some states that are going to do it really well and everyone gets a seat at the table and gets a bite at the apple, and other states where it's 1940, the 1940s again.
I feel like you're looking at me because I live in Texas and
I
I feel
may
judged
have
by
been,
that statement.
right? I mean, but we were talking about this over lunch. I mean, it's there are some places in this country who the political apparatus, whether they succeed or fail, they make an effort to try to move forward. And there are other places that are actively trying to move us backwards, right? And it's a conversation that we have to continue having because there are no easy answers here, right? There aren't, unfortunately.
I would also love us to talk about neurodiversity if you guys would like to. Just we've talked about race, we've talked about gender, but this is something that a lot of people forget about in the DEI is people who have intellectual differences and physical differences. As someone who has epilepsy, this is a huge issue for me personally, but how do we even begin to address that? And I know we kind of talked about this again at lunch. Work from home largely was supposed to be able to help individuals with differences. And now we've seen it as an excuse to get people out of the workforce or pay them less. So, can you guys talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that you learn when you work long enough is that, especially as a neurodivergent person, is that you have to set yourself up because these companies will never do it for you. But then one of the things that people don't realize is that the ADA statutes stipulate that if you have any legitimate condition, PTSD, whatever you're dealing with, you can request from your HR group an accommodation to be allowed to work from home permanently to be able to accomplish your job. The problem is that HR groups in most companies will never tell you that because their leadership it will look at them funny if they do because they don't want them to. And there are other things at play why they're gatekeeping that. But I think the first part of it starts with education of those of us who would like to take advantage of those accommodations need to educate ourselves about them because they're never going to do it for us. But then also we need to accept the fact that just because someone doesn't think the way someone else does,
Mhm.
it doesn't make them strange, right? I think
Right.
the biggest problem we have around neurodiversity in our society is this idea that you're not normal, right? That if something happened in your youth and you were traumatized and you have post-traumatic stress disorder off of that, that there are treatments, and that just be and that something broken in your head is not any different than a broken arm or a broken leg. Most of these things can be solved with medicine and treatment, and we don't talk about that nearly enough.
And
Amen.
I'll just add, so my 9-year-old, our 9-year-old, he is not diagnosed with anything. As a black child growing up in Maryland, when we put him in therapy, they actually encouraged us not to have him diagnosed so that he would not end up being tracked in some way. So I then
Smart.
began to do just my own research around neurodiversity as a mom,
Hmm.
right? Not just as an educator who's setting policies, but as a mom, what does it look like for me supporting him? And when they called me and told me my baby was at school stressed out cutting his hair, I said, we're not doing this. We're going to take the stressor out. The stressor is school. He went through therapy. He's graduated from therapy in like just a couple of months. But what happened was we started to navigate around him instead of making him navigate around us. And that is what systems do, right? We set up these structures and make them so firm that people are trying to figure out how to navigate around them versus taking the walls down for everyone and ensuring that folks have the opportunity to see access for some actually provides access for all.
Yes.
The greatest story for this is when you look at a curb. The curb was made for the little lip at the curb. That was for handicap, for wheelchairs. But how many people also get to benefit from it? Families with strollers, right? Like so many get to benefit when we start to solve diversity problems. People just get scared when they feel like something is going to be taken from me in order for someone else to have something. Baby boo, nobody wants to take anything from you. Literally, people just want to be free. They just want good wage. They just want
Amen.
to enjoy their family. They just want to be great and help women be great, right? Like people just want to live and be great. We've got to get out of the ego and make sure
Mhm.
that we get back into the heart and mind of the work that we do.
Yeah, I will add sort of a slightly different thought, which is I think in today's world, you have to find an advocate, whether that's your parent, whether you're able to
Yes.
advocate for yourself when
Yes.
you're old enough, whether it's a teacher, whether
Mhm.
it's a doctor, because I don't think that we're equipped to deal with things.
Yep.
I had my daughter was severely injured in playing volleyball in high school and ended up not being able to go to school for several months. How helpful was the school? They wanted her to kick her out. and so we had to actually hire a lawyer and threaten to sue them.
I mean, unfortunately, that's what it takes a lot of times, right? You have to have multiple voices saying, I will litigate and I will come for your entire, if it's a school, for example, teacher's retirement fund, or I'm coming for your all your profits this quarter and everyone else here. Unfortunately, in this country, it takes a class action
But that
to
takes
make things happen.
resources and knowledge and time that most people do not have.
1,000%. I mean, it
We don't.
requires it requires people with, like I said, the knowledge and the access, but also the heart and the empathy to give a damn. And unfortunately, a
Yes.
lot of people that are in those positions, the only advocate that they're ever going to have is either themselves
Yes.
or some sort of a legal clinic or a legal defense fund that are supremely understaffed and underfunded and do not have the resources to take on a whole class action by themselves. And so things just are allowed to slide and they slide and they slide a little further and they slide a little further until we end up in a situation where we are now.
Well, and I think there's even a deeper issue. Think about how many people in it's the year 2023, how many people have been traumatized in the school system. So
Mm-hmm.
now we all have children, and our children are being traumatized in the same system that we were traumatized in, and our parents were traumatized in. My grandmother was kicked out of it in sixth grade, right? So she was traumatized by it, which then generationally caused traumatization
Sure.
with the education system. So now can those parents go in and say, I need to talk to someone right now because I need an IEP and I know the timeline? And there are advocacy groups that are out there in urban communities, in rural communities, really trying to help folks out. But someone has to, when it comes to DEI, I never want to put the onus on correcting the system on the people.
Thank you. I know. Okay, so one more question, and then we'll have a little bit of time for any questions from the audience. But we've talked about a lot of very heavy issues, and there are a lot of changes that need to be made at a very systemic level. But what are you hopeful about? What brings you a little bit of joy, and what makes you feel like there's going to be some actual change in this area?
I'm hopeful that as more women and minorities obtain positions of greater power and they're starting companies, they're at senior levels in companies, that that will drive some change. I mean, part of the culture that I think that we have today is seemingly, people want to work with people who are like them. So we have a white male culture kind of at the top of most organizations, and they want to see themselves and recruit people and be with people like themselves. I think, I mean, I have at my firm, we had only women working for us for the first 15 years. Now I've hired a couple of guys.
You got to have a token guy. That's okay.
Token guys.
We'll take it.
Yes.
I Look, I believe the children are our future. I, that's seriously where I am.
Take the girl out of Jersey.
Educator. I'm a trained educator over and over and over and over again. I have multiple degrees in education. And so I truly believe that when we stop and just learn and ask questions and clarify things, that we can solve a lot of problems just through communication.
Yes.
We're so fearful of what we don't know and what we don't understand, and we assume that if we ask someone a question, that they're going to get offended. But the reality is, wow, you actually want to talk to me. You want to know about me. You want to learn about
Mhm.
me. And so I believe that the answer to this problem is just let the kids be kids and let's follow their joy because there is something in that. And these COVID babies, they came out different. They tore their head up in hospitals and everything. So yeah, I definitely think, we just need to invest in young folk learning these systems in very different ways and giving them access.
Annie, you mentioned something earlier about how your kids like, no, I'm just burn it all down. And I think if you spend any time, what brings me a high degree of joy is Gen Z is not here for the ruckus. Like they're just not. And then the generations that are coming up behind them, the COVID kids, for example, they're not here for it either. Like all of this, you're gonna do this, and you're gonna come to my office at this time, and every one of them is staring people in the face and going, "I quit," over and over and over again, and is forcing a shift in the way we work and the way we think about work. Because when a supervisor or a senior leader is doing something that is egregious par excellence, right? That you've got a whole generation of young people that are being like, I won't work for you if your values don't match mine. And that's what we haven't been doing in any of our generations, is because the thought was you need a job to raise a family and you need to be able to make a certain amount of money. And those things are all true, but you can find alignment in organizations that are interested in the things you're interested in from a social good perspective, that are going to put money and resources to the things that matter to you and your community. And that brings me a great amount of joy, is the younger generation who is ready to just throw a grenade in it and light a match and be like, I'm not doing this with y'all anymore. Like, get it together or get out of my face.
Thank you so much. Can we get a round of applause for our amazing panel? And then there's a mic in the center.
We have about 5 minutes, so please keep your questions quick for me.
I just maybe a comment. This was a very good discussion, and I feel that kind of an oxymoron, like an irony, is that despite bringing up appearing that the systems have problems, I feel that maybe America or maybe the world today, it's not really systems having problems. And I think you all touched on that. It's about wearing your own oxygen mask first. And I think they, when children grow up, if they are, again, empowering is like somebody else empowering them. But if from each individual soul, if it comes from within, none of these problems are really there.
I'd like to address that. So I'll
Yeah.
address that by telling a story really quickly. During the pandemic, I was consulting for a very large hedge fund in New York. And one of the things that they asked me to do was come out and build out their production team and their AV team. And so I was vetting resumes and interviewing and whatever. Every single time, no matter what the person's background was, if they were white passing, they got shortlisted, regardless of what was on their resume or how well they interviewed. And if they were not white passing, they found a reason, no matter how minuscule. I mean, I'm talking about infinitesimal stuff. Like they came to me and said, Vincent, we want, you're the expert in this field. Give us some names. So I gave them names. And when any of those names were people of color, they found a way to not get shortlisted. If they passed for white, they all got a second interview and they all got shortlisted. And a bunch of us had to go to the mat for a number of candidates to get them that second interview. And so while I hear you that on some level it's a hearts and minds issue, that is true. These systems that are broken all started with someone's hearts and minds, but those hearts and minds, those people are all dead, and those people all lived 400 and 500 years ago. The reality is that there are ingrained and entrenched systems that hold some people up and then hold others down. And until we break those policies and write new ones, it's about hearts and minds and individuals, but it's also about stuff that's written into policy and law.
And one that we're about to see play out with the news, with the SCOTUS affirmative action decision. Our naval forces, the armed forces, they all have an issue with the lack of diversity at the top, right? But this is not going to add more diversity at the top. This is just going to continue to add more folks on the front line because they're still going to go to
the Naval Academy, right, to recruit for their officers. So the system will still continue to operate in the way that it was meant to, and it's still going to put, unfortunately, the lower socioeconomically, lower unhoused, right? Like folks who need options are going to seek it through the armed forces, but they're not going to see those officer rankings, unfortunately. They're not going to get there because they're still going to get bypassed to go to the Naval Academy. So yeah, we've got to look at these systems and stop telling these kids, just do it, just work harder, just and putting that on them.
You got to have
Yeah,
bootstraps.
yeah, I know, not them, but not us either. This is heavy. I'm living a soft life now. I'm done. I'm
But I
sorry.
mean, and to your point is that you have to have bootstraps to pull yourself up by them, right? And I think the point,
You don't get the bootstraps. How
yeah.
you pull them up?
Well, I think the point she's making, right, is that when you need laws like the Crown Law to prevent companies from offboarding predominantly black women for the way they choose to wear their hair, that's not a heart and mind issue. I can walk in with purple hair tomorrow and I'll be fine, right? Like that's the reality.
I want to
But
see that.
I mean, let's do it. But no, I mean, so I can get away with almost anything I want to, right? I can mouth off to my supervisor. I can show up late. I can do whatever I want to if I'm also getting my job done. Other people don't have that luxury, and that's the issue here. It's not one or the other. It's yes and it's both. It's solving the spiritual issue that we have in this country, but it's also at the same time it's breaking down the systems that have caused us not to deal with the dead body that we've been carrying around with us for hundreds of years. That's really what it is.
Yeah. I
Take us
just want to
home.
jump in on K through 12 and your comment on empowering. In my view, it's more about not putting barriers up to what the child is interested in. And I'll give a last story. My son is a chemical engineer today. Yay. When he was growing up, we lived in a nice neighborhood. Our school was safe. There were high quality schools. But yet, the individual teachers and principals in the schools tried to hold him back. When he was in third grade, he was so bored, he did the entire math book in 1 month. And I went into the teacher and said, could he move on to fourth grade math now? Oh, no, that would not be fair to the other children. And I was like, he's very good at math. You don't want him to lose interest. And fortunately, he hung on through his 12 boring years and his years of college and now as an engineer. So
No, I am so grateful for all of your time. Again, round of applause for this wonderful panel. And we'll be around afterwards if anyone wants to chat with us personally.
Well, again, it was a great discussion about a very, very noteworthy topic. So to give them one more big hand. Absolutely.
We really should.
oh, thank you.